Alright, so this is something that's coming totally out of left field, but I wanted to dive into it because it was discussed on the Canucks Conversation podcast. This is all in response to some of the extra notes that we had seen from Nick Kypreos in yesterday's NHL Trade Board 4.0, and we had already discussed this idea in a prior video on today's show. We discussed the Jordan Binnington, Detroit, Edmonton angle because apparently, according to Kypreos, there are multiple teams that would be interested in trading for a Jordan Binnington. But if you take a look at that same trade board and you scroll down past some of the St. Louis Blues stuff, you'll see a very, very interesting name. And it's a name that I think, just in my entire lifetime's worth of being a hockey fan, I would never have expected this guy to be included on a trade board. The trade board will be linked in the description, as is our ExpressVPN affiliate page. Check out the first link in the description to save some money on your VPN, get some free months, and support this YouTube channel all in the process. But of course, the trade board is linked too. This is what Nick Kypreos writes about when it comes to LA Kings forward Quinton Byfield. When the LA Kings consider how to approach the trade deadline, they have to still look up at Edmonton and Vegas in the standings and wonder how they could get in position to knock out either or both of them. The Kings have been knocked out 3 years in a row by Edmonton, finding a quicker way to elimination each time. So, the Kings have to be asking themselves, what can we add that would give us a better shot at beating these teams? Quinton Byfield is a name to watch here for a few reasons. The first is that if LA is to make a big move to counter Vegas and Edmonton, they'll have to give up a significant young piece to a seller, a 22-year-old and the second overall pick from the 2020 NHL Draft. Byfield took a step and finished with 20 goals and 55 points last season, which had some wondering if he could crack Team Canada at the Four Nations, with another elevation of his game in 2024-2025. That hasn't happened yet, and in fact, Byfield is pacing to fall short of last year's offensive totals. Now, that, of course, is a point that I think you should be acknowledging of, the fact that Quinton Byfield, QB, as Snoop Doggy Dogg went out there and spoke about, has been in a spot where his point production has declined. This season, he's got 34 points in 56 games, on pace for 50 points in a full 82, where last year he had 55 points and 20 goals in 80 games played total. So Byfield has been in a pretty up and down sort of development path. This stagnation of his point production is better than some of the years he had prior to, but still, QB has some pretty up and down moments throughout his seasons. I mean, he's in a pretty good stretch right now because he had a 4-point game against the Vegas Golden Knights in a 5-2 win, 4 assists, by the way. He's been scoring a heck of a ton of assists going back to the start of February. But there still is that potential and that ceiling that a lot of people said Byfield would have had. He was a new market Ontario unicorn, a guy in the 2020 NHL Draft whom a lot of us were pointing at Evgeny Malkin, for example, as being the potential ceiling, a ballerina on skates, a bigger guy who plays center, who has some really good skills and goal scoring and playmaking. He's so smart. And he also happens to be this physically imposing beast. There was a lot to like out of Quinton Byfield, and it's why he went second overall. I mean, I don't think it would have been too much of a stretch to say back in the 2020 draft time that Lafreniere and Byfield both had franchise-altering potential. I guess nowadays you can say that Lucas Raymond is the clear-cut above and away #1 player out of that draft, but that's only 5 years removed. We'll see what happens by the time 2030 rolls around, for example. But going back over onto Nick Kypreos' article, if LA wants to add, they want to get some extra assets, they want to be in a spot where they can take over and try, just try, to get by the first round this season and to actually beat the Edmonton Oilers, maybe trading Byfield is a step that they need to get that done. The article writes this, that because Byfield has fallen short of his pace from last year, it's left the LA organization wondering how high Byfield's ceiling truly is, and if the team would be better off focusing on the here and now by flipping Byfield for a more seasoned roster upgrade. Of course, Monday's 4-assist game and a win over Vegas will give the Kings decision-makers pause. There are rumblings that the Buffalo Sabres and the LA Kings have held talks, and both sides may be interested in the package that includes top assets coming from Buffalo. Oh, my gosh, we gotta talk about the Sabres too? Okay, let's go out there and do that. Okay, Buffalo. Imagine Tage Thompson and Quinton Byfield together. Okay, maybe not Tage Thompson. If we're assuming a Byfield trade and the LA Kings want to get a more established piece right now, wouldn't Tage Thompson be the kind of guy that LA would want to target? Like, doesn't that make perfect sense, trading away Thompson for Byfield? Because essentially what Tage Thompson is right now, you kind of hope that Quinton Byfield can be something similar to that. It's just for Buffalo, if they want to get younger, they could do this kind of a trade. They still have some interesting assets as well that are a little older too, so maybe it's an Alex Tuch, maybe it is a Rasmus Dahlin, no, not a Dahlin. Maybe a Byram, maybe a Power. These guys have been linked in the trade block the past little while here too. If the Buffalo Sabres pull off a trade for Byfield and they get themselves everybody else they've had, I mean, just imagine that young core. In 2020, we would be freaking out over the Sabres having Cousins, Krebs, Jack Quinn, and Quinton Byfield. Like, imagine them getting all of those guys. But of course, you know, it's still Buffalo. They still need to find ways to develop these guys and allow them to become NHL superstars. Cousins was on that path a few years ago, but kind of took a little bit of a back seat since then. But I also wanted to talk about the Vancouver Canucks here, because it was written about on the Canucks Army website. Clark Corson wrote this yesterday, expanding on a conversation that Harman Dale and David Quadrelli had on the Canucks Conversation podcast. On yesterday's episode of the show, Quads and Harm discussed a recent rumor from Kypreos suggesting that Byfield could be a trade piece for the LA Kings if they decide to make a win-now move ahead of the deadline. This is the first real mention of Byfield potentially being available, and while it's purely speculative at this point, it sparked an interesting discussion about whether the Canucks could or should try to acquire him. Both Quads and Harm acknowledge that the chances of Vancouver pulling off a trade for Byfield are slim to none, but as a hypothetical, they explored what it would take. This is what Harman Dale said. If you're the Kings, the only way you'd even consider pulling the trigger on a Byfield deal is if he's the equivalent of Marty Necas and you're finding a Mikko Rantanen, except in LA's case, they're probably hunting for a player who isn't quite a superstar of Rantanen's level, but still has term left. The Kings are a win-now team. They don't want this magical collection of draft picks and prospects. It's going to be a star that can help them now. I don't see how the Canucks can pull that off ahead of the deadline. Now, there is a slight conversation on the clip where they discuss Elias Pettersson and how LA might not have the cap room to pull that off and whether or not they'd actually be interested in a guy like Pettersson, but it is written about here, so let's just dive into it quickly. Let's say you get to the offseason and LA looks at Anze Kopitar and says, he's going to be 38. How much longer can he be a high-end top 6 center? Philippe Deneau is getting up there in age too. If they decide they need a future first-line center and don't believe Byfield is going to be that guy, they might start looking elsewhere, Harm said. We know that Elias Pettersson is great buddies with Adrian Kempe, so you can create a scenario in your mind where the Kings poke around on Pettersson in the offseason when they have some cap space to work with. But, and this is the kicker, Rob Blake already made a big swing for Pierre-Luc Dubois, and look at how badly that backfired on them. They gave up a lot, and the contract aged poorly. Quinton Byfield's name even being mentioned in the trade report from Nick Kypreos is interesting to bring up at the end of the day. And so, when it comes to this Quinton Byfield, Vancouver angle, it's a really difficult thing to conclude. I don't think it's going to happen. It's not going to be probably something that we see as a main forefront idea. It just seems like one of these mix and match scenarios where a guy is written about as being available and you can just toss in whatever teams into the mix as to whether or not they could be fits there. But of course, for Quinton Byfield in particular, for Kypreos to label Buffalo as a team that's interested there, I like that Tage Thompson-Quinton Byfield connection. It's something that makes a lot of sense in my mind, whether they're on the same team or if they get traded for one another. It just makes the most sense to me. So, Sabres fans, Canucks fans, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below when it comes to the potential Quinton Byfield conversation. Do you like what Harmon Quads talked about on the show? Do you think that Nick Kypreos has a point and Buffalo could be in here? Let me know in the comments what do you think. I hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.